I'm going to begin reading today from Mark chapter 5, verse 25 through 28. It says, "And a certain woman which had an issue of blood 12 years, and had suffered many things of many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was nothing bettered, but rather grew worse, when she had heard of Jesus, came in the press behind, and touched his garment. For she said, If I may touch but his clothes, I shall be made whole." It's an amazing thing how just the touch from somebody else can make such a difference in your life. You can be going through times of loneliness, depression, sickness, and the touch from somebody holding your hand or giving you a hug, pat on the back, can certainly make your rough time seem just a little bit more bearable. I know that the hug from your child as they say, Daddy or Mommy, I love you, can just bring you out of, bring your heart to great joy and take away much sadness because of the touch of their love and affection towards you. The fact is, friends, we were made and created by God to experience touch and to long for touch. Whenever God created everything back in Genesis, it says that he spoke everything into existence that we see by simply saying, let it be. But when it came to you and I, it was God himself who fashioned man from the dust of the earth by his own hand. God took nothing and made something out of it simply by his touch. And God can do that in our lives. He can take a life that's all messed up and out of control and make something beautiful out of it simply by his touch. And after God touched man in creation, he touched him again and was given a wife called Eve. God knew that Adam needed that physical touch so that he would not be alone. Physical touch is essential for life and development, both physical and psychological. Scientists has realized that there's a very real condition called touch deprivation. Frederick II, who was an emperor of the Roman Empire, had an orphanage do an experiment, which I think was very, very cruel. But they took newborn babies, and he told the nurses there to only give the newborn babies food and care, but to do it with the least amount of touch possible. Sadly, all the babies died. And medical science has recorded that human touch is crucial for physical, mental, and emotional development. Without touch, there's a failure to thrive. A baby's development is severely stunted. They don't gain weight or grow as they should. Human touch is vital for the release of good hormones in their bodies that fight disease and stress. And the lack of touch by others leads to the lack of social and emotional development in people, thus leading to depression and anger issues. So being touched is very important for the physical and emotional well-being of every individual. Have you ever seen a young baby crying and just so distraught that just seems like nothing can help them, but whenever the mother picks that baby up and puts it to her chest and begins to talk to it, that baby begins to quiet down and everything seems to be all right? Well, there's a term that's called kangaroo care, which is the holding of a baby against a bare chest, has been shown to improve a baby's neurological development, their weight gain, and overall health. The same is true, friends, spiritually. We all have that built-in need for God to touch us. This woman that we read about here in the scriptures had an issue of blood, and she knew the only way to have her problem solved was to touch Jesus, even if it was just the very hem of his garment. That touch, though, not only healed her physical infirmity, but also gave healing to her spiritually also. I see in the scriptures time after time where people sought after Jesus to touch them. Actually, the scripture that I just read, Jesus was on his way to touch and heal Jairus' daughter, who Jesus was told was sick and dying. But by the time he got there, the young girl had already died. When this woman with the 12-year issue of blood touched him by faith among the many others of the crowd that surrounded Jesus in their effort to touch him also. In Mark chapter 8, verse 22, it says they brought a blind man to Jesus so he could touch him and heal his blindness. You know, I would encourage you, my friends, to bring those who are blinded by sin to Jesus so he can open their eyes and touch their lives. In Mark 10, chapter 10, verse 13, it says they brought young children to Jesus so he could touch them. You know, I really believe that you ought to take your kids to church, to Sunday school, where they can learn about the Lord and he can touch their lives. And in Luke chapter 18, verse 15, it says they even brought infants for Jesus to touch. Bring your babies to church, and I guarantee he will touch them. And there's virtue whenever he touches a person that goes forth. In Mark chapter 5, verse 28 through 30, she said, if I may touch but his clothes, I will be made whole. And straightway it says the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of that plague. Now notice here in verse 30, Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that virtue had gone out of him, turned him about in the press and said, who touched my clothes? In the crowd of all who was pressing against him, there was one who touched him by faith. And virtue went forth at that given time, and Jesus felt that power go forth into the individual who was touching him by faith. And he said, who touched my clothes? Now, when the woman touched Jesus, immediately virtue was released from his body to hers. There's another instance that I've read in Luke chapter 6, verses 17 and 19, where it says, he came down with them, speaking of Jesus, and stood in the plain, and the company of his disciples, and a great multitude of people out of all Judea, Jerusalem, and from the sea coast of Tyre and Sidon, which came to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. And they that were vexed with unclean spirits, and they were healed. And the whole multitude sought to touch him, for there went virtue out of him and healed them all. When God touches man, or man touches God, there is virtue that is passed from God to man. What is virtue, you may ask? Well, the dictionary says that virtue is a transfer of power from one to another. So when you touch God, virtue is transferred, power is transferred from an all-powerful God to you, which can give you the miracle, the strength, or the needed healing or change you need and seek for in your life. Virtue also means love and kindness. When God touches you, it shows his great love for you, which puts joy and fullness into your life. Virtue brings wholeness to the ones that God touches. The woman that touched Jesus had that issue for 12 years. The little girl that he was going to touch for Jairus, her father, she was 12 years old. Age is no difference. Situation makes no difference. God can touch you regardless of where you're at or what you're facing. In Luke chapter 7, verse 12, it says that there was a dead man carried through the city, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and much of the people of the city was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said, weep not. And he came and touched the bier. He touched the casket that they were carrying the young man in. And they say that bare him stood still, and he said, young man, I say to thee, arise. And he that was dead sat up and began to speak, and he delivered him to his mother. Friends, if you have any children that are dead in the clutches of sin, I encourage you to get them to Jesus so that he can touch them and bring them to life also. But a touch from Jesus not only can take and bring healing and life to a sinner, one who is dead in sin, but it can also bring you back to life also. You know, there are many who hasn't had a touch from God for a while. They attend church regularly or even are busy in kingdom work of some kind, but they really haven't felt God's touch for a while. They get into the habit of simply doing religious exercise where you clock in on a Sunday morning or Sunday night, and then you clock out after service is over. And you go home believing that God is satisfied, you've done your duty, but you go home to a dull and boring life full of troubles and issues. You went to church sick, you come home sick. You went to church dealing with issues and problems and very little joy, and you go home the same way. Friends, when you go to church, don't go just for the entertainment or just for the sake of being there. Go there seeking the Lord, reaching out to touch Him so that He can touch you. I know this is very real because this happened to me. There was a time in my life when I was singing in a gospel group, and we were traveling all over the country every Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I was studying for my ordination to be an ordained minister in the churches of God. I was also leading song service when I was at our church, and I was also one of the deacons in our church. And I was just so busy, but I found out that in all of my busyness, I wasn't satisfied, and there was something lacking. And I went to my pastor, who was very wise, and I told him the situation. And he told me, he says, you know, Davy, maybe you are spending so much time in the kingdom, you're not spending enough time with the king. And that's when I realized that, yes, in all of my busyness, I had just been neglecting to really reach out and to draw close to the Lord. I was busy doing his work, but I wasn't busy drawing close to him. That's when I began to hunger and thirst for his righteousness, and I was filled anew with his wonderful touch. As we close today, I ask you this question. When was the last time that you really touched the Lord? And when was the last time that the Lord really touched you? You know, Mary was busy serving Jesus, but Jesus said it was Martha who was sitting at his feet that had chosen what was important. When you touch Jesus, the virtue flows freely as well as the love of God and his anointing. The miracles, the healings, even the raising of the dead and harvest of souls begin to happen in your life. I encourage you to reach out and touch him, just like that old song that we've learned and heard so many times. So, he touched me. Yes, he touched me, and all the joy that floods my soul. May God bless you today is my prayer.